All right, the room is a little quiet. We're a few minutes before we start. We have several individuals that are online, and I do want to wish you a warm welcome for taking time out of your Thursday to spend a little bit of time together to talk a little bit about the state of broadband internet, as well as mobile telecommunications in northeastern Ontario. We're calling this a conference. Several years ago, NEOnet, I worked with a small nonprofit called NEOnet, which provides ICT services across Northern Ontario. More of that a little bit later, but there was a state of broadband in the year 2015. I am glad to see a reasonable to good turnout today, because including members of NEOnet, we had at that event in January 2015, 19 participants. And today we have approximately 40 that have registered, plus there are going to be participants that have a vested interest in this that are not on the participants roster, because they're going to be sharing a few words with you as well today. Now, before we get the official meeting started, for those that are present in the room, maybe we can take a moment to introduce ourselves to one another. We had invited municipalities, communities, First Nations. We invited internet service providers or telecommunication providers, as well as representatives from some of the funding sources that have helped us in the past and may help us in the future for building public-private partnerships to make what needs to be built happen. Maybe we'll start to my right with this young lady here. So if you want to maybe stand and introduce yourself to the group.
Hi everyone, my name is Tanya and I'm the manager at Riverside.
Wonderful, welcome.
Krista Wilson to the CFTC.
Welcome.
Hey everyone, John Thursday, manager of the CFTC. I also sit on
Here, here. And don't forget, we've got a large enough room that has echo, so do use your lungs, speak loud. No bashing the telcos.
Hi, my name is Sidney DeBell. I'm the CEO of
Welcome.
I'm principal consultant with Ontario North Consulting. I currently work with 7 communities to deploy our solution along that pipeline.
Welcome. You're here.
Matt Brayward, Mayor of the Township of McGarry.
Patrick Miro, Paralympic Migrants.
Tyler Simpkin. I represent Burlington as well. Craig Davidson, the Treasurer Administrator for Smoky.
Rose Thompson,
John O'Farrell, Telecom Services.
Andrew Barry, Consulting, one of the speakers.
I'm Tim Barry, and
You're welcome.
First, Dave Barrymore Advisor, who lives in 2 applications of wireless broadband internet service. John Matlock, and he means Miss not mine.
Almost.
On page 34 of the Township of
Wonderful. And in the back, there's a NEOnet member. Wonderful. So thank you for taking a moment for introducing yourselves. I'm just going to see to bring up GoToMeeting So online, I won't unmute your microphones to introduce yourselves, but I'll go through the list to at least introduce these individuals that are online participating, which are part of this group today, but remotely. We have Talia Domini, that works for FedNor, Dominic Maclot. We have Jeff Buell. He is from Blue Sky Net, and he will be presenting a little later on this afternoon. Brian Walker, Shauna Duchamp, Bill Greenway, Paul Kelly, Jeff Cool, which is, I believe, from our sister organization out in Northwestern Ontario Innovation Center, Jim Antler, Steve Van Groningen, as well as John Shimko. So thank you all for being at this get-together. We have an agenda, and it's fairly tight. So you can see that we're starting at 1 o'clock, which is now, and we'll try to wrap up at 3 o'clock. We had a brief opportunity for networking amongst ourselves since 12:30 as we began the registration. And at the end of our get-together and presentations, 3 o'clock, give or take, we'll have an opportunity to kind of continue that networking. What we're talking about here is not something that can be solved by one ISP, one level of government, or a very vocal individual or business. This will take a lot of collaboration of everyone within our catchment. What I'd like to do before we set this off is I'd like to welcome our Mayor, Carmen Kidd, to say a few words, and then we'll get this session underway. So Carmen, please.
So I just want to welcome everybody to the city of Twisting Shores, and we're very pleased we could offer this facility here today. And I really want to thank Dan O'Meara, who's taking the lead on this whole broadband issue there, and he's organized this conference with NEOnet, and just appreciate all his work. And hopefully we can all work together as a whole region and solve some of the issues we've got. We're very lucky to have fiber within the town limits here, but outside town limits, some of the rural areas, some of the smaller communities, we don't have good service. And whatever service we do have, it ends up being very pricey. So hopefully we can offer some solutions here today and at least start the process. So welcome, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. I'm going to start to talk a little bit about state of broadband internet and a bit of an overview on mobile telecommunications. When we talk about connectivity, we can't talk about physical connections without considering wireless. As we know, everybody usually has a smartphone device around, and it's not just used for voice communications anymore. Actually, the majority of residents within our catchments use this for digital communications, a lot of chats, SMS texting, utilizing it for social platforms and the like. And if we think about it, anything that works on a digital connection that is on the mobile network is at the forefront digital, and voice becomes a secondary item that becomes voice over internet protocols. So we have to think about that paradigm shift, not just for how we think of communications today, but how we're going to see the next generations utilize whatever we deploy today and tomorrow. My name is Paul Ouimet. I am Director of Operations at NEOnet, and I'll take just a brief moment to remind people what NEOnet is. Maybe not everyone knows. We've been around now for 20 years. We began and were a reason of being for working on the first round of deployments of telecommunications. When NEOnet began in 1999, we were for the most part on dial-up. Can anybody remember dial-ups and those modems? That was the beginnings of connecting our northern communities to the World Wide Web. We were able to instill, and most of that was done leveraging our traditional telecommunication companies, which had landlines to the homes. So that was with companies such as Bell, Northern Tel, and Onterra within Northern Ontario. And technologies were beginning at that time, which were called DSL, Digital Subscriber Link services, that provided on average 1.5 megabits to the home. That was amazing compared to dial-up. However, things have changed. The consumption of digital content has also changed. We've been around for that time. There are three things that we focus on. Applications, the delivery of programs for small and medium enterprises, which is usually through a subsidy program to help them grow their business, adopt technology, and scale up wherever possible. We, as an organization for all of Northeastern Ontario, which goes from Hearst, Constance Bay Lake, all the way to this area here and to Temagami, Timmins, of course, as well as Folliet towards Gogama on Highway 144. And we also go up to the James Bay coast. Of course, Moosonee Moose Factory and westbound up to Quantick. That's a very large territory. But we try to deliver on those applications and education to them all. And the one that we're here to talk about today is infrastructure. It's underlined in red. We have been reasonable when you think that we have very low population densities for what ISPs and telecommunication companies were willing to do up until now. The paradigm has shifted with the CRTC rulings in 2017, where they said that internet is to be deemed an essential service, and that for all residents of our country. Now, that's a fairly simple statement, but when you have people that are, on average in our area, maybe between 2 and 5 residents per square kilometer, how do you wire up or connect those individual buildings or people when it comes to wireless? NEOnet has also worked on some of the cellular connections that have been done several years ago. So the Highway 101 corridor towards Folliet and the Highway 144 corridor, as well as some segments of the Highway 11. It wasn't done perfectly. There are gaps along those roads. What do we do to try to bridge those gaps so that underserved is maybe acceptable? Unserved is what we need to try to mitigate. On this slide, you'll see 4 photos. Laura, introduce herself. This is me. We have 2 other team members at NEOnet. This is Sharon Jones. She's a teleworker. She works a lot in our project coordination and as a facilitator. And she's also our administration person for a lot of our clerical activities and bookkeeping. And this is Caitlin Gooch. She is presently out on the James Bay coast working with one of our partners, the Western James Bay Telecom Company, trying to do some inwards in education and awareness to see how we can leverage a partnership to try to bridge that telecommunication gap. This is our catchment, as I've described. We have peer organizations. Blue Sky Net, I mentioned the name Jeff Buell. Their director of operations, or their executive director, sorry, is Susan Church. She may be online with Jeff this afternoon, and there will be a presentation later on. But we also have the other organizations, such as Sault Ste. Marie Innovation Center, Parry Sound Muskoka Community Network to our south, and this large expanse of, for the most part, low population densities other than around Thunder Bay and others, the Northwestern Ontario Innovation Center. We have 1 individual online from them. I see a hand being risen.
Just wondering from a note-taking perspective, are we able to get a copy of the presentation?
Yes, the slide deck can be made available. And if you let Laura know that you'd like to have a personal copy sent, we can arrange that. Thank you for the question. Now, for those that are in room, there's paper and pens on the desks, near on the tables near you. Feel free to write down notes, questions you may have. We're going to be trying to stay close to our agenda time slots, so we may have to do questions a little bit later on and not at the moment that you think of it, if that's okay. Within Northeastern Ontario, the catchment of NEOnet, there's a lot of communities. Between those communities, there are kilometers of road that connect them. But between those distances, we may not have physical infrastructure that is easy to tap into to simply light up a new network segment, light up a new localized network by a newcomer to the table as an ISP or otherwise. And in that, we have First Nations. And it is always a challenge when we look that we have over 60 communities in 200,000 square kilometers. The population density when you do that division is not very high. I wanted to bring notice to what had been done a couple years ago by the federal government with the participation of FedNor. All of us know of FedNor, which are boots on the grounds that have been able to successfully channel public funds to help our communities grow, and for the most part through economic development. A document was created called the Prosperity and Growth Strategy for Northern Ontario. It's all about supporting innovation, growing companies, and building stronger communities. And within that document, but especially during the round table sessions that led to this document, it was apparent that broadband internet and connectivity was paramount and critical for supporting what was identified in this document. On the left here is simply some statistics that I pulled that at the end of the day identify how in Northern Ontario, however beautiful our countryside is, the offset that is somewhat negative is that we have these large expanses of nature, but those large expanses are challenging to deploy technology. And we'll have to come to grips with that to see how do we, in partnerships, improve them. I mentioned earlier that the CRTC came up with a new standard. The standard is to provide universal access in our country of 50 megabits download, 10 upload, and this is for all Canadians. And we also want to try to focus on mobile wireless services, at least wherever possible along highways and major roads, but there is a statement that says where Canadians live and work. The government is made up of many ministries. The major industry that we work with today is up until recently called Innovation, Science and Economic Development, and now it's Innovation, Science and Innovation, I don't remember. My apologies for that. The other one that's very new is that was called the Ministry of Rural Economic Development. It was instated last year prior to the elections, and they still exist today under the appointment of a new minister. And they have also created a document that I'll make reference to a little later on that again puts emphasis on broadband internet to support northern rural communities. What I think is interesting is that the government has stated 3 time frames by which things should happen. 5010 available to 90% of Canadians by the year 2021. Don't get excited. We are likely not, for the most part, in that wave. However, 95% of Canadians by the year 2026, I think there's an opportunity there that we should try to seize. And then the hardest to reach Canadians is by 2030. Now, keep one thing in mind. Hardest to reach may not be just geographical, it may be technical. Along some highways, we have fiber optic runs. Along some highways, we have nothing. If I think of the highway that goes from Chapleau to Sault Ste. Marie, I don't even think there's hydro lines that run along that highway. So how do you expect to energize towers that may try to bridge the gap for mobile wireless? There may be communities that are off the highway and where the strategic position would be for a tower or for a point of presence for fiber optic fed connectivity. There is no infrastructure today, or the geography is challenging. Everything is doable, but at the end of the day, it takes money and sometimes a lot of it to make things happen. And I do believe that we'll need to look at all levels of government with an interest to make sure that we advocate with all levels of where funding can come, which is not just public, but also private with ISPs that maybe in the past with what they've deployed, they've made good sums of revenue, and we may be approaching a juncture where profitability may not just be on new installs on their own, but leveraging prior revenues and revenues from other areas to still be profitable, but sharing to make sure that we move forward. I wanted to bring here a bit of information, evidence-based decision-making. Everything today is driven by fact. There was a time where we had this idea when the birth of the internet came where we said, build it and we'll figure out how we're going to use it. Governments today with public funds are much more strict on where the monies will be delivered. We need to look at how do we prove our case. So in this particular case, it was a quick extraction from Baymap. Jeff later on will explain that a little bit more. This is from Temiskaming Shores. And the important thing here is that we have some categories. And this data set was based on 5 megabits per second. This is 10% of what the new target is. That's significant, 500% more. But you'll notice that at 5%, the accessibility for that grand total is about 98%, if I'm reading this correctly. Laura can always correct me on that. So in this particular case, Temiskaming Shores, at least at a small 5 megabit perspective, is reasonable. But if I bring up instead Temagami, you'll notice that at 5 megabits per second, based on the communities that are listed, the dwellings that are listed here and the types that they are, we're looking at 33%. That is a significant low number that there is no way someone living in that community would think that that's deemed acceptable. And those are the kind of gaps that we need to look at. And don't forget that this is at 5. We need to tenfold that to get to numbers of what our new targets are. And I do believe that we need to look at evidence where we can bring data out to demonstrate what that is. And there's different sources that we can do with that, and we'll talk about that later on when we talk about Connected North. I want to bring this map here. I won't spend much time on it, but this is for the most part our key areas with Highway 101, Highway 11, up to the border with Quebec. And these images are not circles, they're actually hexagons. I put it down here in the title. And hexagons are 25 square kilometers worth of area. And up until recently, whenever we'd ask for funding from the government to build infrastructure, they always referred to this hexagon map. And the way that they worked it out is that if we were looking to put in infrastructure, let's assume 10 megabits a second, which should be easily achievable in higher density populations, they would say that if one person already has 10 megabits per second in that hexagon, then that hexagon is not eligible for that funding. That is a hard pill to swallow when that represents 25 square kilometers. So do keep that in mind. We've been informed in recent conversations with directors representing FedNor that they've received information that states that as we go forward, and the new fund will be called Universal Broadband Fund from the federal government, they will be looking at things much more granular along the lines of the data that we've been keeping that I showed you before that came from Baymap. So that is encouraging. And here there's some colors saying, how are people connecting? Cable, DSL. Sadly, DSL and fiber are associated. They should not, because fiber is an order of magnitude above DSL. And here's fixed wireless as well as the LTE. This is slightly older. The yellow is good. Where there's no yellow, that's not good. I do know that on Highway 101 towards Folliette, Bell Mobility has most of that segment, and they've not evolved the network to being fully LTE. The same reality exists in part with some of the towers along 144. Now there's mitigating circumstances for that, but you can see how the gap can grow when around the horizon in the next few years, some of our larger communities, maybe not in Northern Ontario, but definitely in the South, are going to start benefiting from services that they call 5G. Here's our map, and we're talking about population in Canada. So do remember that about 90% of all Canadians live within 160 kilometers from the border we have with the United States. And that was the reason why I said, don't hold your breath, because we're not likely in that first wave of achieving 50 megabits per second download for the masses. That, in a nutshell, is my introduction to the state of broadband in northeastern Ontario. Now there is good. There are population densities where service providers such as Eastlink have improved their backhaul infrastructure. They put a lot of fiber, meaning that their distribution points on cable coaxial to the home that may bring you television, can also bring you internet, and can also bring you voice services. And they can do so up to 100 megabits per second. We have telcos that have come in as an ISP, and they put in a very strong, powerful series of towers and can deploy high-speed fixed cellular to the home or to the business and provide very reliable services. But there are areas where the infrastructure may be, for the most part, DSL on traditional phone lines. What do you do in those circumstances when there are some evolutionary improvements that can be done on DSL, but they're getting to be quite costly potentially? So it'll be interesting to hear over time, and that will not be today, what the road map is for those areas and those service providers to try to participate in this plan of reaching that 50-10 where they have services today. My time is now 13:20. I should have taken a copy of the agenda, so I'll take one off of your desk here, Manju. So I'm just about working out fine. Before we go into the Connected North and Blue Sky Net's presentation, we have a few minutes if there are any questions for what I've discussed here so far. Dan?
That's a question with the DSL connections with copper. Do you ever see that possibly getting 50 by using copper?
My opinion right now is the answer is highly unlikely. And the reason why I say that is, and I'll maybe ask you for a show of hands, how many people today use VoIP, voice over internet protocols, for either their home or their business? I see one hand that was raised here. I can raise my hand as well, not just for work, but for my home as well. So there's several people here that have migrated to a purely digital approach. When you have reliable internet, you can do that. And the other thing is that we've seen a convergence. We used to have wires to do video entertainment. We used to have plain old telephone lines providing phone. And then we had another line that brought in internet or a network. We've seen that all converge. Many larger businesses have done that decades ago, where in-building cabling was converged network, where you had one or two jacks on your wall, and it fed everything that you would ever want to use. And I don't think that trend is going away. To do so on traditional copper lines, because it's an analog type of signal that is being broadcast, I think there's a lot of challenges, because if you look at rural Northern Ontario, I have family members that in Timmins live on a rural road. All they can get is telephone services on plain old cables. They have no coaxial for TV that's satellite for them, and their connectivity is DSL. When it's spring and when it's fall and there's water in the ground, the quality of their voice line, which is analog, you can hear static on it. So the quality of what can happen on that is not reliable because of the infrastructure. A lot of the wires have been out there for a long while. So my opinion is there may be a point in time, and I don't know how many years or decades that may be, but the trend that I see happening is really going to pure digital for all forms of communications, including voice. And you see that today. A lot of the service providers are combining and bundling their services, and they're often provided with a digital analog telephone adapter device that takes digital and converts it to your old phone. So hopefully that answers your question, Dan. Any other questions or comments? Hearing none, we're now going to be transitioning over to Blue Sky Net. Jeff is online and will be transferring over control of the presentation to him and providing him audio. I showed two photos here. So the first one is of Jeff, and the second one here is the executive director of that organization. It's a sister organization very similar to NEOnet, and Susan's been a strong proponent in trying to improve in her area, North Bay, Sudbury, and surroundings, the improvement of broadband internet.
Thanks for having us, folks. And I'm going to turn it over to our Executive Director, Susan Church, to start off with some opening comments.
Thanks. Thank you, Paul. And Laura, we had hoped to actually be with you in person today. Unfortunately, some outside and external circumstances have prevented that. So I do hope that we'll be able to contribute in a meaningful way to you through the use of technology. And thank goodness that wherever you are, you have access to the internet so that we can actually do this. And of course, that's one of the things we're talking about today, where so many small businesses, large businesses are having so much difficulty. Students are having troubles with being able to access the required things that they need to in education. E-health is a problem, and we're all here today to talk about those issues. We initially started to really engage in development of broadband and technology back in 2003, when we first realized that as an organization at the time, we're an economic development organization, but we realized that in order to assist in the pillars of economic development, the one constant was the fact that we had to be able to compete globally in Northern Ontario. And in order to compete globally, we had to be able to reach out as our larger counterparts do in more urban centers. And so essentially about 2008, our board of directors in Blue Sky region really decided to focus on technology in order to support all of the other pillars in economic development activity. And by 2012, FedNor really stepped up to the plate for us. And one of the things that we're missing is that we really can't tell where our investment is going and tracking the details of that investment, where we can see how working with internet service providers is beginning to work in Northern Ontario. So how do we track that investment? How do we have a baseline so that we know where we are, and more importantly, where we're going? So we sat down and we thought, how can we develop a product that is useful to everyone, whether it's internet service providers, government funders, business owners, the public in general, people who are looking to move to Northern Ontario. What are some of the things that we can do that could capture all of the information that we as internet service engagers, maybe we could call ourselves influencers. Isn't that the word now?
Yes.
What is it that we could do that we could capture all of that information so we could see where the growth is and where the need is and where growth is not happening? So that's where we came up with the idea of building something on a GIS platform that would take all of the information for Northern Ontario and put it in one spot. So essentially, Blue Sky Net was very fortunate to apply to FedNor for funding to build this mapping system, if you will. And that's when Eric comes in. He's the mastermind behind the project, and I'll let him talk to you about some of the ways that we're using BayMap, and he'll tell you what that actually stands for, to help all of our communities across Northern Ontario to develop broadband projects. Jeff?
Thanks, Susan. Paul mentioned earlier on and showed those charts from BayMap. BayMap stands for Broadband and Associated Infrastructure Mapping and Analysis Project. We came up with that idea a number of years ago because we saw that it was becoming more and more difficult to identify gaps in access to broadband. In the past, Paul was saying that NEOnet's been at this for 20 years, and we've been at this for almost as long. It was fairly easy to identify a community that had a density of population that say was greater than 1,000 to 2,000 people. Typically had DSL service, and then outside of that community, there was very little. As years went along, for rural areas, satellite became an option, fixed wireless, cell network, and then some technology improvements to DSL made it reach out further and further. So even though service and coverage improved, what was happening was big gaps became more of a use the term digital divide, but it's really more of a spectrum in terms of access. So today, one could argue that almost Canada-wide, every household has access to some level of broadband service. However, there's great discrepancies in pricing, performance, also discrepancies in really how we define high-speed internet. Paul mentioned in the past, we use measures like 1.5 megabits per second, 5 megabits per second, and now the target is 50 megs. And also there's issues about quality of service, data usage caps, et cetera, et cetera. That aside, it still very much remains an urban and rural issue. Typically speaking, urban folks are way better served, whereas the rural counterparts have less options when it comes to broadband access. It always surprises us a little bit further south than you, where we have folks that move into the area, especially some of the smaller bedroom communities near North Bay, and it's not even a consideration, the limited access to the internet. So that just goes to prove that urban dwellers tend to not even consider limitations of broadband. So what we turned to in terms of quantifying those gaps was to develop a fully functional GIS, stands for Geographic Information System. And we use that to visualize, to display where the coverage gaps are, but also to analyze the impact of that. So it's one thing to be able to map coverage, but it's something totally different to be able to analyze the impact of that coverage or that lack of coverage. And the goal early on, and which we eventually made it to, was to be able to assess the coverage availability as close to the address point as possible. There's multiple data inputs, as well as there's multiple users of it. One of the main contributors early on was municipalities. Also, internet service providers. We found those were sometimes, say 10 years ago, those tended to be two very distinct camps, where you had municipal councils would hear from ratepayers that would say that they can't access whatever internet service they wanted, and it tended to overestimate the impact or the size of that lack of coverage. Whereas ISPs, it was a little bit more difficult for them to exactly explain where service was and where service wasn't, not because they were being deceitful, but because sometimes it's, again, a spectrum, a varying degree thing. So we take all that information, and I'll show you some examples in a second. So we've created this very extensive database of coverage, as well as base maps from the likes of MPAC and census information. And we've created this database, which can be shown in tables as well as maps. And we use that to make sure that there's consistency in terms of analyzing the scope of service issues. And we share that with, again, municipalities, economic development groups, or even individuals that are looking for service options. And more importantly, or most importantly today, the last 6 or so months, is we're making sure we do our part to communicate to the various levels of government, as well as their funding organizations, to ensure that the proper benchmark of gaps in coverage are represented in Northern Ontario. What's showing on the screen now is a screen capture from Baymap. So these Christmassy looking colors represent green, which is usually a wired service. So that's the footprint of a wired service. So that would be fiber, DSL, or cable. This, by the way, is Highway 11 south of North Bay. Anything in red is the lighter speed services, so the extended DSL or fixed wireless. Pink, yeah, sure, it's red to me. So again, if you knew this area, this is Highway 11. If you can see my cursor, Highway 11 runs roughly north-south here. Sunridge, South River, small urban communities. This is getting down into Emsdale and Huntsville. So again, and Magnetawan over here. So again, tend to be villages or clusters of population where are a little bit easier to serve. When you get out into the more rural and suburban areas, that's where extended DSL or fixed wireless tends to take over as the only service options. And then anything in white or unshaded would be areas that could only access satellite or only access 3G or 4G, in some cases 5G networks. Now these purple squares in the background, those are the MPAC property parcels. So through a license with MPAC, we received 510,000 individual property parcels, and we use that is our main and most accurate base map. So we compare those green and red service levels against each property parcel. So we say if that coverage intersects with those properties, return the value of who the service provider is and what level of service they can get. This is just a screen capture of the database that we created with that. So again, 410,000 records.
If I can just pop in too, some of you might be asking, how did you get the information? When we very first started the process, we worked with every internet service provider across Northern Ontario and with those that own infrastructure. So represented, all of them agreed to work with us. And we have NDAs with all of them that allow us to exchange freely information with them. Of course, we don't, the old adage, Sears doesn't tell Edens what they're up to. Same thing, we keep that information between ourselves, but we provide reports to those that need it. So the ISPs are very at ease when they work with us and they provide their information readily.
So just very quickly, what this table shows here is about 5 columns of information that we received from MPAC. So that would be the roll number, the type of property, so the class of properties. So there's 800 different classifications of properties, from vacant to seasonal on water, seasonal away from water, residential, poultry processing plant, LCBO, auto body shop. So there's many different fine details. And then, of course, across the right, this is our comparison analysis that shows what level of service is available to that property. So we can look at an individual property and answer questions about people, what services are available, but we can also roll that information up into the municipality or to any other geography, as well as by the service provider themselves.
So we always say, when it comes to what Paul was talking about earlier, which was the hexagon mapping, that in the past has been what the federal and provincial government have depended upon, as opposed to knowing what's in a 25 square kilometer blob, we can take it to the driveway level. And that's what we work very hard to do, to make sure that it's very accurate to the property level. Right.
About 3 years ago, we took a lot of that Bay map information and we spun it out into this public portal that we call Connected North, connectednorth.ca. One of the main features of the portal is an availability checker. So that queries that big database. So this is an example. So this is in Temiskaming Shores. So this is a good example. You don't put in New Liskeard, you put in the actual municipality name, enter in your address, and then you can check availability. It will query that database and return back to you the contact information of the service provider, what type of service it is, and what speeds are available. We've recently, with Connected North, attempting to engage, not necessarily pushing out a lot of information. There's a lot of information on the site, but we're also trying to engage the people who visit. And one of those things is through surveys and network speed test. So down at the bottom, this is just below that availability checker. We've asked people to run speed tests, and this isn't really much different than any other internet speed test, except that it's our own. It's built on a platform that is the same. It runs on any device or browser. So again, you put in your civic address information, the type of service, you run the test. This test is actually hosted in Sudbury, so it's right near a strategic interconnection point of a lot of ISPs in Northern Ontario. So as a tester, as someone visiting the site, you get those normal measures that you get on any other internet service test. But what we get in the back end of this website, it populates a form, and then we go in and collect that information on a spreadsheet. So this is one of the big focuses that we've been doing in our consultation with the funding programs, is that we're ensuring that there is a good benchmark of user submitted information to represent Northern Ontario and the realities of broadband access in Northern Ontario. So just maybe just let me know, folks, if you're still able to see this. Are you able to see a chart now?
Everything's good. We're looking at your bar chart.
Okay.
One of the things, just while Jeff's queuing that up, that we've been working with the Ontario Ministry of Infrastructure and also with the folks at the Universal Broadband Fund, as well as conversations with CRTC folks in terms of helping them understand that there's more than one mousetrap in the world, and that we would hope that they would engage in receiving the information that we're collecting here, and they've all assured us that they will. And that's encouraging. We've actually had them come to us to ask a number of questions and set up meetings so that they can understand the reality of what we're all facing in Northern Ontario. Because when we hear the large national statistics that are thrown around, and Jeff will show you in a second how that can be impacted, and they say that 86% of all Canadians, can achieve the target speeds. When you take out the rural areas in Canada, specifically when you take out things in Northern Ontario, those numbers change drastically. And so that's what we're trying to do by gathering all of this information.
So in the calendar year of 2019, we received 2,150 unique verifiable speed test results. And again, these numbers that I'm going to tell you probably skew a little bit down. Not many people go to Connect North when they're happy about their internet service. So we recognize that these are people that have issues, and therefore they're there to engage in a process of how to improve it. But on average of those 2,100 plus speed tests that we received, the average download speed across the board was 9.2 megabits per second, whereas the average upload speed was 5.2 megabits per second. So on this chart, you see it broken down by district. Greater Sudbury is considered a district by StatsCan. And of course, this is our average trend line of 9.2 megabits per second. Greater Sudbury, of course, skews very high. We're almost at that magic number of 50 megabits per second. Again, the most major urban center in Northern Ontario, this isn't much of a surprise. Muskoka is next with 17 megabits per second. And then we're looking at Cochrane and just right about average at 9.19 megabits per second. And the district of Temiskaming skewing down quite a bit at 5 megabits per second. Our next chart, we also capture time of day when the test is being run. So this also is supported by a lot of the results from other internet speed tests. Morning and afternoon tend to be, for whatever reason, a lower congestion time than in the evening. So at 4 o'clock to about 11 o'clock, This is that that orange result. The average result, so we received 800 and some tests at that time. The average result goes quite a bit further down, and that's of course when everybody else is on their streaming service of choice, impacting everybody else on the various networks. And then overnight from 11 p.m. on to about 6 a.m., the speeds bump back up. Next, looking at it by service type, not many surprises here. The big green bar, 145 megabits per second. Those are the folks that have gone to Connected North and run tests using fiber. Cable is next. There's a large number of people that don't exactly know what kind of last mile service they connect with. They're right about average at 9.5 megabits per second. And then moving down, folks that connect on cellular networks, satellite, DSL, and fixed wireless, rounding out the bottom. When you remove cable and fiber, of course, the average, so when you remove the highest performing service types, the average in Northern Ontario goes down to about 6.6 megabits per second. So back to that last chart. So this is average download speeds by type. And then this next chart that will come up is the number of tests by type. So again, we suspect that if you're happy with your service, you're less likely to engage in a network or into a website like Connected North, and therefore unlikely to run speed tests, which is indicated by the very few number of fiber and cable services. Was quite a few people that didn't answer, didn't know what their service type was, and then more folks from satellite, DSL, and fixed wireless tended to use our test. Just one last thing I'd like to show you is just how we're starting to visualize this. This is really in our kind of this is early on in our efforts to try and communicate this back to the public, but this hopefully will soon be live on Connected North. So this is a summary. We're zoomed out. We're looking at Northern Ontario. The different colors are the districts of Northern Ontario. And again, here are our averages across the north. If we zoom in, we pick Timmins is a fairly good example. So we see that the clustering of the speed test results spread out to more accurately represent where they come from. The further you zoom in. So over Timmins, it's not really a surprise that those numbers change. That the average speed is 22 megabits per second. Average upload speed is 13. But when you scoot over next door to a smaller, more rural community of Black River, Matheson, quite a few more tests, got 109, 110 tests, but lower than average download speeds as well as upload speeds. So we were 20 in Timmins, and now in Matheson we're about 6.5 megabits per second. So if I were to show you, and we've worked with our communities in and around North Bay quite a bit to promote Connected North and running the speed test. If I were to zoom into that area, I would show you some very similar results. North Bay, of course, having quite a bit higher speeds, and then when we move into Callander, East Ferris, and Powassan, if you know the area, we're down around 4.5, 5 megabits per second. So again, this is going to go live on Connected North fairly soon. We're also developing a position piece that will be sent to the federal and provincial government.
One of the things that I would really urge all of our participants today to do is, if you have any means, any vehicle to disseminate the information of asking residents and business owners to go to connectednorth.ca, take the speed test, fill out the internet survey that's there. We're communicating all of this information back to our funders. And what's really key about that, all of us across Northern Ontario, all 5 of us that are funded by FedNor, to work with all of the municipalities and helping them to really increase their footprint in broadband coverage. We all use this to help develop the applications for you. We either act as proponents in applying for funding, or we certainly work with the ISPs to help them. But we really use this information to communicate the need. The need is great. We know it is. We've all been working in this area for a very long time, and we're all very passionate about helping you as municipalities and communities to achieve these goals. So I don't know if there's any questions, Paul, if you have a way of taking a few minutes to receive questions, we're happy to do that. Oh, just before we go, I should show you something. I don't know if you can see this map. This is really funny. This is how we used to track our progress. We used to put colored stick pins in maps, and every time an ISP would develop a new piece of a network or provide coverage that maybe provided 1.5 megabit, that was like big. We would put a stick pin in the map, and so we've progressed a little bit from that.
Great anecdote, Susan. We do have a few minutes. Does anybody have a question here in the room? If somebody has a question online, I know Laura can keep an eye out on the chat, and maybe you can share your question that way. Anybody here in the room that has a question? Yes, please.
How do you report not being able to access the internet?
Yeah, so one of the question is, if you cannot access the internet whatsoever, how can you report that situation? I'm going to take a question. Did you want to?
That's a really good question. So one of the things that we try to do is work with our municipalities to really engage them in the process. And if someone absolutely has no ability to go onto the internet, and even if they have just a tiny little ability, that's one of the reasons we use this Speed of Me speed test, because the test is actually run in little tiny small files, so that it does load easily on very, very slow, small connections. However, if you work and live in a community that has no access at all, that's when we're really looking for our sister ICTNs to work with those municipalities to get the information into their town office, to their Grand Council office, to deliver internet surveys where people can fill out what their concerns are. And that information is then communicated back to Blue Sky Net, and we then have Jeff map that information. So he's not going to be mapping speeds because you can't take a speed, but we are also developing a process where we can map the internet survey results.
Perfect, good answer. And I'll extend that a little bit. We did see on the chart that Jeff shared, Black River Matheson. They've been part of an initiative to try to get some evidence-based content to say how poor the services are. There are a lot of people in that community that have nothing. There's no DSL. They could do a modem, but who today has a dial-up modem? Let's be realistic. What we did is leveraging the survey that is exactly available in Connected North. We mimicked it on a paper form, and that was distributed through the municipal network within Black River and Matheson. People could bring that home, fill it out, and give it back. We have not yet collected those physical papers, but they then become data that we can mimic based on the address that they provided for that location that has no service, to build it into a data set that shows where there's something and where there is nothing. So maybe that answers the question, and that requires all of us to work together. And the other way is that if you cannot do something at home, if you have a student, a child that goes to school, well, use the services there. Do a visit to the local library, or like I said, put it on paper and then share that, because we need to collect the reality. Because when you think of the bureaucrats and the politicians sitting in Ottawa, their day-to-day reality is different than our own. So when these people look at asks, they may not truly believe what is in those asks because it's not their reality. Any other questions? Yes.
Service providers have various different package level service that they offer. Is there any accounting in your system to qualify whether the speed test is at all related to what's being sold?
Okay, good question. Now I'll paraphrase, and you correct me if I'm wrong. There's a question from the floor that says that these speed tests are presented without talking about the cost or the level of service provided by the ISP. Is there some way to corroborate those information so that we understand where they're meeting the expectation or that the service is lower? Pass it over to you.
That is a discussion that we've had internally and something that's come up a little bit recently, and that is something that we'll investigate. And if I understood the question, it's putting in basically 2 more information points where the tester is saying what they're paying for, basically what they're paying and what they're paying for. So therefore, we can match it up with the reality of the test.
So there is
that
a
is
gap
something
there, definitely. Before I go to you, I'll go to this gentleman.
Just one to highlight on.
Can I just, Paul, can I just follow up on that? The one thing we do want to be very careful about, though, is this process is not there to shame anyone. And one of the reasons that we're developing and have developed really good relationships with the internet service providers is that we're trying to work with them to make things better. But sometimes we find out, for example, if a person is someplace where they are supposed to get up to 25 down, and the best they ever do is 1.5, you know what, there might be a problem there. So we go to the internet service provider directly and we say, you know what, buddy at 642 Frontier Road's only doing 1.5. And that's happened so many times where we've been able to work with the internet service provider and actually resolve the problem that they didn't even know they had.
And sometimes it really has nothing to do with the ISP. It has something to do with the network inside the home.
Yeah.
Yeah, great points. Thanks for extending on that. You had a comment or question?
Comment is just to build on that situation in Cochrane. I have 600 plus customers that can get 50 by 10. 80% of those customers will not take more than our minimum service level.
Yeah, good point.
And the other part on bandwidth people don't understand is what, to your point, what are we using it for these days? And IPTV takes up a huge chunk of that bandwidth. So when your speed test says you've got 25 or 20 and your television's gone, that's not.
Good point. Now I'll paraphrase that for those that are online and for the benefit of Susan and Jeff. This was a ISP provider in the community of Cochrane where they have over 600 clients. They can deliver for the majority of them over 50 megabits per second download. However, many of those subscribers have chosen a smaller package, which has a limited download capability. And the other facet that was mentioned was, depending on what you're using your connectivity for, if in your home you have several dozen devices, things that are like a Google Home or Alexa, there's a lot of traffic that might be going there. And the other thing is that if you do IPTV, do realize that that is pulling a heck of a lot of data down to your home that consumes that bandwidth. So if you're doing something concurrently while that is occurring, such as a speed test, you won't get accurate results. So hopefully I paraphrase your statements. Perfect. And there was one final question. One final question. Did you want to have a comment, Susan? Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say we're totally aware of that, and we've had very lengthy discussions with funding agencies and ministries as well. They get that too, and you know what? This isn't absolute science. We're crowdsourcing, so we're depending on people, to make sure that they don't put 101 cell phones in little red wagons and screw up the Google map. Yeah. Like it's exactly the same thing. We respect that those things are happening. What this does is paint with a fairly broad stroke down to the property level, a sample of what's happening. And so that's what we look at it as, and that's what we believe the funders are using it for as well.
Perfect. And I look at it like a reality check. If somebody from the government says, Here's your reality, and here's what we believe you receive. Isn't it nicer where we can do our own speed test leveraging what's in Connected North and either corroborate it, terrific, or realize that something doesn't seem to jive? Now, something not jiving doesn't mean that it's that ISP's problem. As has been mentioned, is there something going on in your house? Is there something a little bit off with the cabling causing interference and reduce performance in those download and upload speeds? It means that we have something that we can research and corroborate and determine the root cause. If the root cause is that the infrastructure doesn't meet the expectations, well, then we have something collaborative and constructive to move forward with between funders, the ISPs, and the subscriber towards something else. And the other thing is to say, what are you purchasing as a service level? If I buy the entry-level package that throttles me back at 5 megabits per second, then I should not be complaining because I'm not getting 50. That's not the package that I've signed up for. Yeah. So let's give that some thought as we go forward. Dan, one final comment?
I guess the one comment that I have is that I know in Tomago, we have a provider that says, has maps that show service levels a lot more than what actually exists. And the fact that those maps are there cause a problem because it looks like we've got service in areas where we're not.
Yeah.
How do you fight that? Or how do you counter?
The comment from the floor is from Dan O'Meara, Mayor of Temagami, and he's indicating that there are some ISPs that publish maps, and I'm assuming this might be wireless type of services, and the maps kind of they exaggerate or they demonstrate where there are service levels possible that in the real world, when you do go there physically and try to do that level of service, it's not true. How do we work on trying to improve on that? And I think, Jeff?
And that was one thing when we went out early on with Baymap, that with all this information that we have shown, we will never show a coverage limit of an ISP. So, we said to the ISP community, we said, we're not interested in marketing materials. We're not interested in where you're promoting your service. We want to know exactly as best as possible where the limitations are. And we made the, lack of a better term, the sales pitch to them to say that it would be in your best interest to do that because we're going to use this information to qualify applications for your service. So if you're saying that you have to make it so that you're ineligible or that area is ineligible for funding. So that's the way that we've tried to combat that. These speed tests, as Susan said, we're not trying to shame any ISPs, but what we do with this is to do a little bit of ground truthing. So those are the two ways that we've tried to address it, because I agree, Dan, it is an issue.
Perfect. Thank you very much for those statements, Jeff. And at the end of the day, garbage in is garbage out. And in some cases, these are theoretical maps generated by software based on conservative numbers that apply to the topology. It's not a perfect science. Terrific.
No, but it's pretty darn close, Paul.
Well, thank you all. Thank you very much, Jeff and Susan, for participating, albeit remotely. We really appreciated the slides that you showed us and the live data that you showed us within the data set. So thank you both. We're now 2:15 and we're following back from our break. And I'd like to welcome Dan O'Meara. He is the mayor of Temagami, and they've been working for a while with regards to the realities and challenges of broadband internet. So I'd like to welcome Dan to the lectern. On the agenda, we've called this Internet, a Municipal Perspective. Dan. Thank you.
Welcome. My name's Dan. I'm the mayor of Temagami, and I guess this is all kind of new. One of these things, public speaking, being a mayor is something that probably kept me out of being in politics for a while, but being mayor, you have to get up and start doing some of this. So bear with me, and we'll go from there. I would like to welcome the group here today. One of the things that we found out is if we're going to do anything with this particular issue, we're going to have to work together. Why? Well, I've been in politics now for about 6 years. And if you ask anybody in our area, what's the biggest issue? It's internet. We have in Temagami, we have a large lake area. We have people that come on seasonal and would probably move to our area or set up shop in our area. But our internet services are not that great. And I think you could see from the slide that we're probably an area that needs some assistance and a plan. So our first step as a council was we had to do something. So we started with a broadband assessment done by Mario Bernardi Consulting, and that we felt that also we have the opportunity to work with Temagami First Nation, who also has need for internet and improved broadband. And so we worked together and we did a study. And what did we learn? First thing became clear. To do this or to move ahead, we will require a rural area partnership. And why do I say rural area? And why do I say this? Funding is limited, and only so many projects will be approved. So for Temagami to take its proposal and try and go forward right now to CRTC, we've been told that we won't have a lot of chance. We wouldn't have much chance of getting approval. It's a larger communities. If you look at the service levels in the larger communities, they don't have this. A lot of them don't have this problem. And if you're going to get service providers to do this, you're going to need some volume. And the other thing that we noticed is governments are starting to pay more attention to groups coming together. There was a recent application that municipalities were asked to put in, and there was hundreds of, maybe 150 applications. 26 of them were partnerships, and they got funded automatically. So if we're going to come together and do something, we need to come together. And many of us, again, are too small to do it on our own. Number two, even in a community like Temagami, we have 3 or 4 different areas. The solutions to those particular areas will differ between the areas. Like I say, our solutions differ. The larger the region, will require more of a collective array of different solutions and approaches. So I guess we have to come together and put together a plan, but it's not going to be one plan for every community that gets involved. It's going to be a lot of different solutions and approaches. Number 3, we learned that there's a considerable amount of infrastructure out there. And to get access to it at a reasonable cost and getting some of the outdated support infrastructure that needs upgrading will be a challenge. If you drive by most communities, they have fiber that's going through the old Ontario lines are there. In terms of what capabilities are there, there probably is some capacity that's there that's going by your communities that we're not tapping into it. One of the from the way it was explained to me, and I'm no expert on it, is that one of the reasons it's the infrastructure that uses and transport that actually makes things better it needs upgrading also. So we've got some challenges, even though we have the structure. And it's not like some of the communities where there's nothing in the ground that goes by a community. Our studies show that there's quite a bit of infrastructure out there. Oh, this will be a good one. Will require provider involvement somehow. We had the opportunity to meet with Bell the other day. They're interested, but they're a business. And to provide internet service to Lake Temagami, probably not high up on their list, because they've got other things to do. we got VNet. We went and talked to VNet. VNet said, "Oh, you guys, one of the issues that you have is that Bell, we need Bell's connections. And Bell will probably want a fair dollar for those connections." And then we have community broadband is. Maybe the solution is to develop our own system. I don't know. But I think to do this, we're going to have to sit down with some of the providers and try and come up with a regional approach to this. And it could be different in different locations. Number 5, going to cost a lot of money. Temagami itself, to bring proper internet into Temagami, I think we're estimates anywhere between $3 to $5 million just for the capital. So that's going to be a challenge. Number 6, there are funding programs becoming available. CRT funding is now available. Will Temagami put an application in? We would probably need a few people to come on board with us very quickly because the deadlines are there. So, yeah, and somebody said it's not going to happen. But I was at Roma the other day, and the provincial broadband funding was recently announced. Apparently it might be old money that's there, but there is starting to be money coming available. We need to get ready and get in line now. John Vantoff, who's here, and I'm glad he came, had an article in the Temiskaming Speaker, and he put it quite well. Somebody needs to take this bull by the horn and corral it. Working together is necessary to find a solution, but he added that it's not going to be easy or cheap. And I want to know who's in. And that's our purpose of coming here today, is to try and get our local communities together, working with NEOnet, working with whoever wants to help us do it and get a reasonable plan, and let's get in line and let's start making a difference. Thank you, and I'm open for questions.
All right, any questions from the floor for Dan and his presentation and the challenges that many of our communities realize and live with day to day? I'll ask Laura to see if anybody through chat may have any questions for Dan. Yes?
What type of prior service provider did you have in the first place?
We have.
So the question that's being asked on the floor is who or what kind of service providers are in Temagami today?
Temagami today, there are really 2 providers. Onterra, who has a kind of a DSL link system through the phone systems. That's in town, and on the lake, which is quite a large area. They were able to, once they brought fiber optics to Bear Island, they've been able to get DSL services out to a certain level, a certain area. But after, and I think it's so many miles away from Bear Island, then there's nothing. We do have ExploreNet. ExploreNet has a system, a tower in town that's broadcasting out to certain areas, but there are certain areas in town because of terrain that don't even get that. Now they are saying that they're supposed to be able to go right down the lake, but I live at the far end of the coverage area, and I've been told by the installer that if you don't get cell service, you're not going to get their services, and that's why I raised the question about the maps. Is they're saying I should be able to get a 50, but the only way to prove it is for me to pay $200, $300 to get the guy to come out to try to do the install, and so it's something that we want to talk to ExploreNet a little bit about.
We're going to the exact same thing. Like we had Ontario at first, and they thought of it super L type thing, and then they kind of just like abandoned us with the DSL cables and all that stuff. So we would get by with like a small community around like 50 people, you know. So
as a follow-up for those that are online, there is a conversation on the floor with regards to some of the challenges with some of our providers. Some, as an example, like Ontario. They are kind of an orphan type of service offering within Northern Ontario. Ontario, as most should know, is no longer a publicly owned entity. It was part of Bell, it was taken over by Bell Alliant, and shortly thereafter in that time frame, Bell Alliant became part of Bell. So that if I understand it correctly, and someone can correct me, Ontario is an orphan, and right now there's no plans for enhancing those services. And even furthermore, in many, if not all communities, if you move away from your home or if you sell your home, the service then becomes null and void, and the new property owner is not allowed to continue your services. So it is becoming challenging, and we need to come up with solutions, working with our ISPs, so that'll be a question that I'll have for Northern Tel and Bell, is when we have those types of orphan solutions, of which funding was provided by the governments. NEOnet participated in that process for Northeastern Ontario. What's next? And if it's not tomorrow, what's the roadmap to get us to an option? Or is the service provider deciding to not be there in that market anymore?
I'd be interested to see if you can get an answer for that, because when you phone Bell, then they phone Ontario. And
Yeah, NEOnet has gone through that challenge, and there's a lot of bouncing around in the circle, and nobody wants to stop and provide a true answer. Those are things that we'll have to be conscious of as we go forward, because these challenges are not going to be solved in a day. But as Dan has mentioned, time is of the essence when there are funding opportunities that have closing dates in either February or March, or we wait for the next intake channel to try to move forward to bring dollars to the ISP to make sure that it's a public-private partnership to make this happen. Because not all ISPs can do this on their own.
In fairness to Bell, I know we had the opportunity to go down to their offices in Toronto the other day to talk about cell service and broadband. We talked a little bit about some of the requirements that are there. We have to have them at the table. They did have a rep here today. It's a start, and I think we've got contacts now with them that they're going to be a main provider, whether it's whoever, because they got so many different identities or divisions. But we do have them on the line now, and they're listening, and that's a little bit better than what we've had maybe a few years ago. So I think it's a start. At least we can communicate and get the information that we need. Now, Bell's, it's a company. They're not. They have a business to run. They're going to look for solutions that are going to at least break even or some sort of value. So that's why we've been told, as many of these communities, if there's a group up in the Cochrane area that want to come together, the more we can scale this, the better off it is. And that's why I've talked to Paul, and that's why we're here today, is to get people and come up with a plan so that we've got the volume that's going to make it work and make it profitable. So say, hey, boy, we better get involved, or we're going to lose a lot of potential business here. And I think that's the goal. And hopefully today is a start of that.
Yeah, terrific. So we're one last question. I'll go to the gentleman in the back.
Just a comment.
Or comment.
Like you had said that if we don't meet the deadline, for this time, I would suggest that if we don't meet the deadline for this time, the work still has to continue, or we won't make the deadline for the next time. It's got to be a progression.
Well said. So for the benefit of those online, the gentleman in the room has basically said that if we don't make use of the time that we have now for the upcoming closure of some of these funding opportunities, let's not panic, because there's going to be other intake opportunities. However, let's not sit on our laurels saying the time's on our side to do nothing. Let's be ready for the next intake to ensure that we have access to those fundings where appropriate and where it does make sense.
And in discussion with that, I did have some discussion with John Bantoff about, at Roma, they did talk about some money. There is some money now that be available if we can move ahead. So I we got to move forward, and we've got to get our act together, and the sooner we can, the better off it's going to be, because some of this, if you got a plan, then at least you can push it somewhere. Yeah.
How are you reaching out to the different municipalities to get us together? Are you doing it through TMAC? Is your clerk sending out a request for resolution to come together?
We started it today.
So the question that's from the floor is basically saying, for municipalities, communities, and First Nations, how, with Dan's initiative and his presentation today, how is he reaching out to the other municipalities of the north?
Okay, I guess basically we started today. And we will be, I know on Saturday, we will be talking to the Temiskaming Mayor's Group and start from there. Unfortunately, today there was a meeting up in Matheson of some of the northern municipalities. I guess they have a kind of an, I forget their acronym, but it's all the different towns coming
they're
together.
called NEOMA, the Northeastern Ontario Municipality Association.
And if anybody's interested and wants to get involved, we're going to try and get Paul to help and myself. I guess I'm trying to be I'm going to be the one that's going to try and take the bull by the horns. I guess someone's got to do it, and I'm there and I want some help. And so if people are interested in it, I can give you my card or just go on the Temagami website because we've got to get involved to make this happen. And
All levels of government,
we can get.
Residents and businesses alike have a role as we move forward. This will not be solved today or tomorrow. We're looking, as I mentioned earlier, a time frame of a few years, several years, and a decade when we look at our entire country. So let's be patient in the process. For the sake of time, I know that we've got a speaker that's going to be wanting to share some facets of this. And the sense of urgency for Dan and his community is that they've spent monies, had consultancy work put together, and the idea now is, what do we do with this? Because we want to get to the next level towards finding a solution.
Thank you.
So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much. Write down some notes, and we will definitely continue the conversation. This is the start. It's not the end all. I'm going to get a slide preparation prepared for our friend Amadeo Bernardi. He'll be talking a little bit, I'm assuming, about the Canada Rural and Remote Broadband challenges, the insights that he can bring to the table, as well as assistance that he has provided to some organizations and that he might be able to provide as we go forward. Thank you. So, Amadeo Bernardi, everybody.
Thank you very much for having me. And fortunately for all of you, I thought I only had like 5 or 10 minutes. So make it home earlier. I want to thank Paul and Laura and Mayor Dan for having pulled this together and having and starting the conversation and having me here. Amadeo was a very popular name back in the day in Timmins, where I was born. So I'm sure many of you have heard the name before. As you know from Mayor Dan, I had the good fortune of working with the municipality of Temagami and Temagami First Nation to look at their broadband connectivity. A lot of talk about Ontario here today. So for 10 years, I was part of Ontario. I was an executive with Ontario Northland, and I was the executive in charge of Ontario up until the sale. So I was part of the process with that. So I have a very, very good knowledge of the broadband connectivity and state of affairs in northeastern Ontario. Following the sale of Ontario to Bell, there were various regulatory and competitive issues that were triggered, as many of you have been referencing today. But I'm not really going to comment on that today directly in my talk. It's not my direct topic. I'm here to talk about the lessons learned from Canada's Rural and Remote Broadband Conference. So in 2019 in November, I founded the conference. It was the inaugural event in North Bay. And I was very pleased with the reception it's received and the feedback. And so I have a bit of a few lessons learned from that. The conference came together through my many interactions with municipalities, First Nations, and service providers. The cross-section, it's in this room actually, across the north and across Canada. And there was a common theme I started to realize. And that is that everyone knows that broadband is important. Actually, it's essential to communities' well-being, economic development, educational and health services, and so forth. But most felt like they were alone, not sure what they should do next, and unaware of what options were out there. So after many, many conversations with friends and peers and government officials, I was challenged actually to do something about it. So thanks to the initial support and prodding of a company called Calix, I decided to host a conference with the goals of information sharing, networking, and education, and focus strictly on the challenges of rural and remote broadband. So it wasn't a conference where it was a subset of that, and it wasn't a conference where service providers were talking to service providers. It was trying just to start the conversation, as the mayor had mentioned previously. And what I witnessed across the country is that communities need to come together to jointly make applications for the scarce funding pools that are coming available. Have a plan, have a roadmap, size up the problem, and come together regardless of their topographies or proximity. So tools like Baymap, those are tools that everybody should start looking at. Coming together with NEOnet, coming together as communities, as Mayor Dan has talked about. Clients of mine, BC's Connected Coast, had 130 communities strung out along the coast of Western Canada. They all came together, and that went in as a large application. And so they're doing an ocean fiber project, but it's bringing communities together. When I talk to funders, they want to see groups. They don't want to see onesies and twosies. And why is Bell seemingly so successful in securing funding? Well, I would argue that one reason is because they come together with regional requests. So it's, for government, one check to write. Based on the feedback I continue to receive from the conference, it seems like mission accomplished. Well, initially anyways. We shared information, we did a lot of networking, and we learned some new stuff. As this session, though, is proof of, the momentum needs to continue, and there's a long road ahead for all of us. There are no quick solutions or silver bullets. There's not enough government funding. We do not yet have alignment between all levels of government. Not even the programs within the same government, and even how funding should be allocated. So the funny story is, during the conference, I hired an audiovisual company, and the owner was there doing the conference, and what did he come away with after 2 days? He came away with the question, what the heck are green hexagons? and we thought, okay, that's kind of funny, and after that I decided, well, that would be kind of a fun name to name my new conference company, which I've actually incorporated, Green Hexagon Incorporated. Hopefully it's a good omen, we'll see. But anyways, Chris Seidel from the CRTC was the executive director of the CRTC. We were having dinner that night, and he's the one that leaned over to me and said, you know, you can take this message and probably repeat it 12 times across Canada. It was a bit of tongue-in-cheek comment, but I am pleased to announce that there will be 3 conferences this year. So while North Bay was billed as Canada's Rural Remote Broadband Conference, and we had people from BC, Nova Scotia, Northern Quebec, the US, the message still has to be brought out. And so I'm going to go regional with it. In Banff, we'll be there May 5th to 7th. Then hop on a plane, and then a week or so later, we'll be in Fredericton, May 19th to 21st. And those 2 conferences will follow the same format as North Bay to share information and start the ecosystem and the conversation. But in October, in Deerhurst, October 5th to 7th, that will take a slightly different tack. And that is basically another lesson learned from the conference. And that is, what next? So the feedback was people wanted dual tracks. And so we're going to introduce dual tracks. We're going to have sessions on technical, on policy, even on finance. There's communities and First Nations are going, there's a lot of programs out there. There's some new funds coming out that I'm actually working with in some communities that are looking to social funds and stuff like that that are looking to help communities. So there's a lot of options that are starting to get out there. So what are different options and how could we work together? And another item is creating workshop sessions so that you can get together with a subject matter expert of something that is of interest to you and work through the problems and come up with some action items. So There'll eventually be a quarterly newsletter so everybody can contribute and share the information. And eventually the website's going to become a repository of all this information and links to other sites and efforts that are going on. What else has come from the conference? I think it's reignited a focused conversation. I've been contacted by regional groups facing similar challenges across the country. Been on the phone with BC's Columbia Basin Broadband Corporation, Alberta's Cybera, and Nova Scotia's iValley. And they all want to work together to build a bridge. What about Northern Ontario, though? I've been in discussions with interested parties actually looking to create a pan-Northern organization that will work to pull us all together north of 905 to form a unified voice, something like what Mayor Dan was talking about. I don't initially see this looking like an EORN or a SWIFT or a North Superior Region Broadband, if you're familiar with all those. But it should, however, be a central body with a singular voice focused on ensuring Northern Ontario's broadband needs are understood and lobbied for. Initial discussions seem very positive. Dan was referencing costs that we experience in the north. I have clients of mine that experience $12,000 a month for gig transit, $17,000 a month for a gig, up in the 20s and 30s of thousands of dollars to connect their communities. It is not difficult, it is impossible to make a business case to support a community with those kind of costs. So the idea is, let's come together. So if you're hopeful, if you're interested, give me a call, track me down, and we'll continue looking to move this pan-Northern idea forward. In closing, I just want to thank you for inviting me, Paul and Laura, to participate. If there's any way I can help or keep the conversation going, please let me know. Again, to reiterate Mayor Dan's message, we have to come together to lend strength to the north and conviction to our broadband needs. So again, thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'd be willing to answer.
Any questions for our friend Amadeo?
Kind of the question I would have is, does every community need to do what we've done, or could we do it collectively, or we need to spend some money to put our requirements and our needs together in a single. We still have other things to do to move that forward. But if the community wants to get involved, what should they do?
I think they need to reach out to their neighbors, like to you, and form a group. So there is data out there. The data has started. Even your study, we did map out some of the regional coverage. There's information available. As Paul had mentioned and as Blue Skies mentioned, they have a repository of data that they keep active. So the data is there. But I think the critical piece is you need to come together as a group, and you don't need to be next door neighbors. I mean, look at Connected Coast. There's hundreds of miles apart. I represent 10 communities at Lake Superior, and they're 4 hours apart, some of them, between Hornpain and Wawa and Chapleau and Michipicot and Missinaibi. But the key ingredient is it's a cross-section. It's municipalities, First Nations, language minority municipalities. These are key, and they're actually spelled out in the current broadband fund. The government is actually calling it out, saying you can now be a group of communities and come together. And I believe on the matrix, you'll probably score better. In my discussions with the directors of some of the Indigenous funds, I know that's very key to them too, for federal government. So.
There was an individual.
Is there a way we can jump in with a comment, Paul, for Blue Sky?
Yeah, go ahead, Susan.
Thanks. Thanks, Amadeo, for your presentation. One of the things I thought I would just share with your group as a follow-up to what you're talking about, with all of the ICTNs across the north, that is our job to do exactly what you're suggesting. And just to bring you up to date, in North Bay, where we're located, for example, we have 4 regional projects that are going into the CRTC fund. And that's exactly what it is. We divided up the area and combined the First Nation communities with municipalities to submit applications for funding. It's not just the CRTC, it's anything that comes along. So you're quite right that you don't have to be living next door to each other, and working with the ICTNs like NEOnet or the Northwest Innovation Center, or up in the Sioux, or down in the Muskoka Community Network area. That's exactly what we can help you with, is to do exactly that. Work together, bring the municipalities and the First Nations together. So we do all have unique geography, and that has to be taken into account as well. So when you talk one pan-northern organization, perhaps it might, we might want to exhaust the plan that's already in place.
Great. Thank you very much for those observations, Susan. Thank you very much, Amadeo. Much appreciated. I'd like to maybe share as I transition in a moment towards the funding known and unknown. Our country wasn't instantaneously a country. We had initially, I'm assuming, railroads, and prior to that, little trails back and forth for horses and buggies. We started building highways. Highways have evolved to have on-ramps and off-ramps. We've now, over the last period of time, been talking about this digital highway. NEOnet often says, if you're not online, you're not in business. To be in business, you need customers. Those customers, which are residents, must also be online if you're a digital presence to sell your wares. So it's important to keep in mind that funding 10, 15 years ago was a different paradigm from a public perspective than what it is today. If I go back a few iterations with the federal government at least, they had Connecting Canadians. An ICTN such as ourselves or Blue Sky were not invited to the table to provide applications to Connecting Canadians. That was privy to the ISPs and the telecommunication companies themselves. Who benefited from that are mostly the nationals, because they, again, did a large footprint that covered a regional need. And as was mentioned at one point, like by Amadeo, the government, this is my perception, prefers to cut one large check than 55 smaller checks that each will have a process update on each of those project timelines and reporting needed to make sure that they're achieving, for the most part, their objectives, so on and so forth. So I think that that regional approach is going to be something to keep in mind. Now, we cannot forget about our ISPs. They're in the business of providing a service that we are interested in. So communities may know who's already in the neighborhood. I don't think it's a bad thing to reach out to them, as Dan has indicated he has, but also other communities. Because we have people that are in the room today now, and some that may not be in the room but are online, such as ExploreNet. They're new in the Northern Ontario geography, and they have delivered good. Like everything, and you've indicated that with some other ISPs, where the maps that were produced, which may have been more theoretical, scientific, using calculations, may not match exactly the reality. Well, how do we continue the dialogue to improve and bring to their awareness where those gaps are, and try to work constructively towards a plan to bridge those gaps? And to support some of our local ISPs. We have some smaller, mid-tier type of providers that have done amazing work addressing a very punctual geographical need, and some of those want to consider growing their networks as well. So we need to look at that. And Amadeo mentioned it when it came to pricing. How much does it cost to tap into that backhaul? The challenges we have are that for the most part, they are privately held, and some of those are owned for the most part by Bell Canada. And the cost of access is quite high. How can we bring to the table those realities where we have the technology, we have the skill set, we have the people and the companies locally that can build that local network to address what we need, but they have to plug into the rest of the World Wide Web. And how do we do that cost effectively? I don't have an answer, but we do know that potentially a political will may have to be at the table at some point. And that's where all levels of government, with municipalities that are here today, can definitely have a role in that process. So thank you. I will just, funding. it takes money to do anything and everything. And as you've heard this afternoon, we're not talking about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. We're talking in the millions. If we wanted to do a total addressing of the challenge to make sure that everybody gains access to 5010 for all residents of all Canadians, and that it become an essential service. On this particular slide, I'm trying to convey what we know of today. NOHFC, the Northern Ontario Heritage Fund Corporation, part of our Government of Ontario, has been a major partner over the years, helping both NEOnet put projects going forward, as well as ISPs on their own to move their initiatives forward. Just off the top of my head, I know that Hearst was a benefactor for assistance from NOHFC. I know that some ISPs have applications in the queue now trying to work out to be able to grow their networks with public funds available through them. NEOnet was successful a couple years ago when ExploreNet was considering to come into this zone. We were hoping to bring public provincial funds to the pot to grow that network even beyond what ExploreNet had as a plan. We were successful in getting a few $1 million for that approach. Unfortunately, between the proponent and the federal government, we could not work out a deal. So those monies went unused to reinforce that network. We are thankful of what NOHFC has done and can continue to do. We can actively provide project proposals to them today, moving forward and saying, here's what we'd like to do, and here's how we see that materializing over time. And a little bit of what's been talked about here is that a small project that is to address an issue with Black River Matheson, just to name a community. At a Northern Ontario level, that may have traction. But when we go to Infrastructure Ontario, or if we go to the Government of Ontario with ISED, Innovation, Science and Economic Development, we become a small grain in the sand when we're competing for the same dollars that the larger national telcos such as TELUS, Rogers, Bell are competing for. And that's where I think there is a value when we look at a regional opportunity. Not to say that we're necessarily saying that one ISP must do all of the northern project proposal, but let's get together to say that there's a partnership within the area of Temagami and a surrounding group of communities. And we may have someone else that might be out in Cochrane or Kapuskasing, and they have a project proposal for their particular interest. These, in my opinion, can be combined to make a larger case for more dwellings and residents gaining a service and a larger footprint of geography being addressed by these solutions. And I think that will have better traction when it gets to the larger corporate headquarters of our governments when we compete across the larger nationals. So do keep that in mind as we go forward. CNGN, this is a smaller interesting thing that came up where they were offering $50,000. There is a March 3rd deadline for that funding opportunity. And again, let's not panic where it says it's either now or never. As we began this conference and our dialogue, we said 2021 is the year by which 90% of our Canada will have 5010. 2026 will be 95%. And I think that we, for the most part, a good part of our community should be in that category. And by 2030, the target is, whether we'll meet it or not, is Canada will have coast to coast to coast, 50 megabits download, 10 megabits up for all residents. CIRA is another one that's been mentioned by a few individuals. They have two levels, 100,000, 250,000. There's one of those. There's several of these. That target is coming up at the end of this month on the 27th. CIRA is the Canadian registrar for internet domain names, and they have a strong strength in trying to provide funding for rural and grassroots types of initiative. It's not just to build the internet, but it's for other facets of the internet as well. And I put down here this reminder of not-for-profit. some of the funding requirements do require it to be channeled through a nonprofit community agency, and such an agency is NEOnet. In the past, we've gone through millions of dollars of investments that have been channeled to our ISP and telecommunication partners. We hope to continue having a strong role as we go forward. I mentioned a while back that Connect to Innovate as a federal funding agent pool of funds. We weren't at the table. Connect to Innovate that followed allowed us to be at the table. But when we looked at the criteria that came through that, and we worked with some of our partners to say, how can we work together from a regional perspective? The time frame was very aggressive from the time they launched the program till when they closed. No one could meet it, and we knew that we were fighting against dollars that for the most part may have better chances of being gained by Bell's, Rogers, TELUS. So for the North, there really wasn't much engagement at that level, sadly, to leverage that for our needs. I put here CRTC, they have a deadline date of the 27th, and I did put this here for the province of Ontario. Late last year, the province of Ontario, through Infrastructure Ontario, said, we are willing to receive unsolicited project proposals. They didn't say how they are going to use them, how quickly they're going to decide, but I do think that this is an untapped opportunity because we can do so in a fairly simple approach where it's not a fully engineered proposal, but it's basically saying, here is the concept. And a little bit as we do with NOHFC with stage 1 applications followed by a stage 2, if they believe it to be worth further research, we can kind of investigate that. So let's keep that in mind as well as we go forward. Here's, I think, what's coming. We do know that the government of Ontario, Infrastructure Ontario, had promised in the last budgets announced in 2019, approximately $350 million for broadband and cellular. We had a chance to meet with its director, Fausto Ignalice. I may have the pronunciation wrong, I apologize. When we were at the Rural and Remote Broadband Conference that Amadeo inaugurated in North Bay. It was a great dialogue. There was nothing to report at that time, and he at that time indicated that it'll likely be made public by the end of March into April. So if you have some information that came through, Dan, from Roma, please share that with us because I'd be very interested in knowing if it's part of the same or funds that were brought forward from another envelope of funds. And the important one is really this Universal Broadband Fund, UBF. This is what's been branded from a federal perspective. CRTC is part of our government, and they have set out a very lofty goal that by the year 2030, we will all have a minimum of 50 megabits download, 10 megabits up. There's a big gap to get there, and it's our opportunity to kind of advocate on what the realities and the challenges are in our environments, come together to say, well, where is the problem when it comes to Temagami? Is this area good and this next area not so good? Same thing when we look at other communities. If we go to Latchford, if we go to even Timmins, there's pockets within Timmins, Ontario that businesses would love to have much more connectivity and throughput, but the telco's coming up and saying, well, we'll do it for you if you give us $50,000. Well, that's building the whole infrastructure that they need to connect one client. There must be a better solution because not all businesses can afford that kind of cash outlay to grow their businesses because they may not be able to recover that in a reasonable time frame. UBF has been announced. The Universal Broadband Fund right now has a dialogue where you can go online and provide opinion, provide comments before they roll out the nitty-gritty details of what that will be. And again, there will be multiple intakes. To get to the objectives that we're talking about here with broadband at 50 megabits download for all will not be done in 6 months or a year or 2 years. So we do need to manage our expectations and maybe partner up with some of our local ISPs that have their own growth plans. Do I know what Northern Tel has as a vision officially when it comes to Ontario services. I have it anecdotally from both employees as well as from subscribers. But where's the real proof of what their plans are? Because we need that roadmap. Each individual ISP have plans. If they're not things that they want to share publicly, NEOnet is willing, under a non-disclosure, to have that conversation so that we understand how, okay, there are pieces of the puzzle already in play. How can we leverage those pieces? How can we make sure that they can get the funding that they need or the commitments? Because sometimes an ISP will say, I can build this, but what's the proof that I'll be able to make this financially viable? Because at the end of the day, it's to be profitable. So there may be needs in some cases where they'll come up and say, can we get a commitment of at least having 30 customers potentially that if we build it, they will be our subscribers for a period of time. At least this way there's a commitment of cash flow to support a given investment. And then there's the other thing saying an ISP, they have a vision, they have an idea. What can we bring to the table from a public perspective to make it a public-private partnership in funding this project to move it to fruition and to make it real? On this slide here, there are two things that I want to make reference to. The Rural Opportunity National Prosperity. This is a document that was produced by the new Ministry of Rural Economic Development. And throughout this document, they talk about broadband for rural Canada. And I think that we can leverage that and open up a better dialogue with that ministry to understand, okay, how is this going to work? How are you going to help us in low population density rural Ontario gain access to the funds our ISPs need? And I already mentioned this one before, the Prosperity and Growth Strategy for Northern Ontario. I know that FedNor is quite conversant in it. They played a major role in developing this document for the Government of Canada. And again, that might be a channel by which we can get better dialogue with ISI, the new Industry Canada, the new Innovation, Science and Economic Development, because they hold the purse strings. They're the ones that are going to provide the $5 to $6 billion that have been mentioned. And hopefully we're going to start seeing some of those larger numbers sooner rather than later. So hopefully that'll give you an idea that we have to take this in a paced way, and we do need to manage expectations. A stupid statement, Rome was not built in a day. We are not going to see a paradigm shift that will be radical within months or years. But we need to work with our existing ISPs. Some of them are here in the room. Paralink, we've got Exolink, we have online ExploreNet, we have Bell, Northern Tel, representation partially through Ontario. Let's work with who's in the neighborhood to see what we can do. Because it's not me expecting and demanding something that will make it happen. It will take those partnerships. On those statements, any comments or concerns? I see a hand up on the back.
Yes, I think we share the life experience with broadband services.
Okay, so maybe I'll ask you, for the benefit of those that are online, if you want to come up to the front lectern, and I'll have you describe that here so that this way I may not have to paraphrase it for the benefit of those online. And what's your name, sir?
George LaFave.
George LaFave. So this will be the one and only item that we'll do. I'll go into wrap up thereafter, and then we can continue the conversation as we do the networking once we're all done. Please.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, I guess I'm not here to rain on anybody's picnic, but to show you that sometimes the rose does have thorns on it. The town of Blatchford first got broadband internet services in 2007 from Ontario. Unfortunately, it didn't reach the total customer base within the community, so it doesn't go back to Ontario, the complaints, but rather to the municipal officials who got beat up at that time. 2017, we had another kick at the cat. This time it was ExploreNet. ExploreNet's first intentions were to create a service tower located 9 kilometers south of Blatchford, where our cell service is provided from, and most of the town, unfortunately, doesn't get good cell service. We appealed to them to move the tower into a location where it would benefit the users. They did agree to that. They erected a tower in Latchford. Prior to the tower being completed, they reduced the height of it by approximately 25 meters. Unfortunately, there's 40% of the town of Latchford that lives along the shore of Bay Lake, serviced from an area called Murphy Mill Road. All of those customers, very few of them can get access to the internet. And we're told by the provider that it's unfortunate because of the trees, et cetera, the foliage, and that prevents the signal from getting through. And these people are living in those areas for the quality of life it provides. They're being encouraged to do such things as chop down trees, et cetera. And of course, they're not going to do it. So guess who gets beat up again? It's the council. And we've tried to explain to them that we're powerless to do anything. And the one other issue that really gives us grief is the fact that our phone lines are very old. Our senior citizens trying to contact their neighbors or phone their family or anything like that, a lot of them can't get through because of these phone lines that the service rep from Nortel tells them are too old and can't be repaired. And unfortunately, that's not going to happen too quickly. But what we don't need is an increase in broadband service, but rather fiber optics. We have the infrastructure within the community, all the poles are there, and an installation of fiber optics would provide the level of service the community needs, not another rebirthed broadband, with no disrespect to broadband. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, George. A lot of what we've shared today are anecdotal in part, real in another. There will always be challenges. And the opportunity that we have is to at least identify where something is a gap and try to work constructively together to make sure that our message is eventually heard by those that can make a change. As it is today, I'll just give you some examples. A little bit of number crunching was done for Northern Ontario. This is from one of our colleagues at Parry Sound, Muskoka. Our population in Northern Ontario is approximately 780,000. The average population per household is about 2.6 residents. When I churn this through and we look at the idea of total fiber investment, when we assume, because of the low population density and the larger distances between them, the pricing can be as high as $50,000 per kilometer to lay this cable. In some cases, it can be lowered to around 22 to 30, but just to put a number out there. When I number crunch the whole thing, total fiber investment based on $50,000 comes up to $2.5 billion. Now, there are going to be communities where we can have tighter density of population, and it might make sense to put fiber to the home. That may not be realistic because of the cost that this may incur. If you can find pockets that are unlimited to provide the monies that we may need, terrific. Remember at the beginning I said that the government, through their funding, has said $5 to $6 billion. We'll likely run out of that before all of Canada has this type of service if we look at connectivity that is physical to the home or to the building. There are approaches that have already been seen. Our mobile phones connect through wireless, and the ability for fixed cellular to the home or even just a high-speed enhanced LTE can do quite a bit as well. We're going to have different types of solutions. It won't be a cookie-cutter solution for all situations, so do keep that in mind. All right, to move forward to try to wrap this up. Again, this is not the end-all, be-all. This is an opportunity to kind of say who's at the table between ISPs, municipalities, funders, and how do we get our message brought forward to the province, and how do we get the message brought up to the country, the federal departments that can provide channeled funds to help us out. In the wrap-up, we need to figure out what the role is of ISPs, communities, and how together we need to collaborate and more than likely partner with one another. So here I put down a few things from an ISP perspective. Our communities, our residents rely on the ISPs to expand and share with us what their plans are going forward. If I have DSL today, from Northern Tel or from Bell or from Ontario? Is there a roadmap that says, how are you going to get me to 50? Or are you saying, no, we're done and go talk to someone else? We need to have that type of candor in our conversations, because otherwise there's going to be a break in the path to get to the goal. And that's where, if we need to consider non-disclosures, let's have that conversation. The other thing is cost. If an ISP has an enhancement plan, what kind of money are you looking to need to make this happen? Some ISPs may be able to do it themselves. Eastlink in the community of Timmins did a lot of private investment for rolling out their back end network over fiber. Where we're at today is to connect the customer, the resident and the business. Well, how can we come up with a partnership where public funds could maybe be asked for to help you along that path? NEOnet, I believe wholeheartedly, not just because I wear a hat of an employee of NEOnet, but based on past successes in the millions of dollars for channeling public funds, federally and provincially, we, with our peers such as Blue Skynet, Parry Sound Muskoka, Northwestern Innovation Center, and more than likely the Sioux Innovation Center as well, let's talk and see what our role can be. And again, there might be requests for proposals that need to be discussed. And I'm going to invite Laura to maybe come over here and expand a little bit on what the needs of an RFP will be. In Connect to Innovate, the application needed to have a fully engineered solution. That can't be done by me. That's done by the pros in the technology and the services, and that's the ISP themselves. I'll pass it over to Laura.
In the past, NEOnet has worked with one ISP when we issued an RFP, and we have realized there are many solutions out there and different approaches to the problems that many of your communities are facing. So what we're asking from the ISPs is to let us know what your plans are. We're going to be posting the RFPs, and we want you to respond to them, and even if it's just to a small area, because we're also looking at partnerships where we'll be able to work with more than one ISP as we go into the projects and acquire funding. And how much are these projects going to cost? How much are the ISPs willing to put into the project? And those are the kind of conversations that we need to have when we post those RFPs. So we're going to be looking for solutions, not just from the major telcos, but from everyone out there that is providing service. And if you can help us upgrade your service in your area, then that's the RFP we want to see. We're also looking for these as soon as possible because of the March, if we're going to submit anything for the end of March for CTRC, they are also looking at group funding. And so those proposals will look better if we have a consortium of municipalities and ISPs working together to submit the projects for these upcoming deadlines. But there are others that are going to be opened up soon. So that's what we're working for. And we need to have those projects ready. You can see that the deadlines when they open up these projects for CTRC, they opened it up on January 28th. It closes March, I think it was March 27th. So that's a very short time limit for us to issue RFPs, have those discussions with the ISPs, and make those commitments from the municipalities. So that's why we need to start now for these funding proposals. Even if there isn't anything on the table right now, we need to be ready for when the next round of funding comes up.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Laura. The idea is we should look at this as a continuum. And we rely a lot on our ISPs to basically say, what are your plans? Where are there opportunities? Foleyet, as an example of a community, for the most part, is Ontario. It is, in my opinion, an orphan service offering, and it has been problematic for some of the subscribers in that community. Their B plan, their major option today, is Bell Mobility using the cellular network and turbo hubs. It works reasonably well to good. However, summertime with the Ivanhoe Provincial Park, thousands of people congregate in that area, as well as seasonal residents that go to their summer camps. The number of subscribers on that cell is so high that even voice calls become problematic. And forget trying to do texting or internet. It's at a crawl. Somebody mentioned the idea of a lifeline. What can we do to impress on the funders that this is a lifeline to make sure that somebody can reach 911 when something goes wrong? It was mentioned by George for Latchford. It's the reality all over the place. What about our highways and cellular services? We didn't go into any details, and it's not the forum today, but we know that 5G is around the corner. 4G is a reality in many other communities in a much stronger way. If you go out and buy an automobile today, even an American-made, North American-made General Motors product or others, Ford, you'll notice that they often say over-the-air upgrades. Your automobile has a subscription to receive its firmware updates or its recall things that might make the engine work better. All of this is done on a digital network now. What if you park your vehicle and you have no cell coverage? You will not be getting the repairs that the manufacturer can automatically send your way. More exotic vehicles like Tesla have been doing that since they came out. Traditional combustion engine manufacturers are adopting the same technologies. We have to think about how that may impact us in Northern Ontario if we don't have that foundation, that infrastructure. So thank you, Laura, for going into that. Just to wrap up very quickly, the role of communities have been talked about by Dan. It's been mentioned by others, including Amadeo. It's really regional opportunities. And as was mentioned by our peers at Blue Sky Net, the speed tests and the surveys can help demonstrate with evidence saying, time out here, the numbers that were provided to us by Bell for their cellular coverage, you know what, it's not truly there when we go there. Well, we have the real numbers based on the speed tests that we can do and document in those surveys. And in areas where we have nothing, well, complete with your residents a paper survey, because that will help us move forward. And then the other thing is we're opening a dialogue. Now, for municipalities, communities, and First Nations, that dialogue may need to be formalized through a resolution or a memorandum of understanding. NEOnet, thanks to the help of Susan and her team in Blue Sky Net, we have a draft hard copy that's on the side table, so feel free for municipalities or communities to take one to see if that's something that we can look at, just to strengthen our opportunity going forward for this dialogue that needs to continue. And finally, collaboration and partnerships. That's everybody. That's the communities, that's the ISPs. NEOnet can play a role in that process. It also deals with the ISPs to come up and say, this is what we can deliver as a piece of the puzzle towards RFPs that we may be submitting or requesting. And then the idea of levels of government, simplifying bureaucracy. We've heard anecdotally that some ISPs have had long delays in trying to get permitting in things that they wanted to do, as well as land use. So is there a role that the municipalities can play to help out the ISPs in getting quicker on the path and to make sure that we're all on the same page to get to the same end goal? So those are some of the things that I wanted to put together in this collaboration. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Carmen, for this opportunity of being here in New Liskeard. And we thank you all that took time in your day to listen in and provide some questions and comments. The conversation doesn't end here. We were limited in time. So there is an opportunity for networking before we wrap up and go. And again, consider NEOnet by phone, by email, or on our website, and consider chatting with municipalities. So if an ISP is looking at being in a community and you haven't yet engaged the municipal team, consider doing so. Dan?
Just we do have our local member of parliament, John Bancroft here. John, do you have anything you want to comment on, or you made some comments in the local paper that I picked up on, and but since you took the day and came here with us, you might have a few.
Yeah, so before you answer, for those that are online, Dan O'Mara kind of asked a question of John with regards to any words, because he is our member of parliament. If you have any word, John, maybe I can invite you to the lectern, and then this way I won't have to paraphrase for those that are online. And we will wrap up with these final words. Do stay around for the communities, take some of that paperwork, and make sure that any kind of muffins or Timbits remaining that you take on with you, because I don't want to bring them to Timbits. John.
Thanks, Dan, for the invitation. Thank you all for coming and access to broadband. I don't think we have to convince anybody. It's one of the things I notice 6 months a year in Toronto and 6 months a year here and on Gillies Lake. There's a whole lot of difference between what broadband is. And I hear a lot about funding, and we all have to work together to get the funding. But we also have to make sure that actually the smaller providers have access to the fiber optic backbone. Right? We hear that a lot, and all the funding in the world isn't going to change that. And that's something I think that we have to recognize and that we have to work together to overcome. That's one of the keys to this issue. And I think that's something that part of the bull that I have to take is that, right? Because everyone needs to make money, but there's certain things that have to be regulated publicly so everyone can have access. And my example that I always use, and I've used this over and over and over, and maybe it doesn't apply here, but I think it does. If electricity had have been brought to Ontario the same way that internet has been brought, there would be many rural routes in this province that would have never seen a hydro line. And my farm was on one of those rural routes, and I did a lot for the economy on that farm, but it probably never paid the utility to put all those poles in. There are certain places where the public has to step in and regulate, force, help, whatever word you want to use, but to make sure that the basic infrastructure is there so that the people who can provide the service can plug into that basic infrastructure. Thank you very much for this day, and we're going to continue.
Thank you for those closing words. And to echo what has been said, there are going to be challenges. This is not going to be done overnight, but we do have to play a role of advocacy and the idea of open access and to have reasonable pricing. As was mentioned by Amadeo, if you're paying $17,000 a month to connect to the backhaul ability on a fiber backhaul, go back to a major center, let's say Toronto as an example, or Sudbury, you may not have enough customers to cover that cost monthly. So what is the role of the political will to ensure that there will be some happy medium? Because you can't expect the residents in Timmins, Ontario, Latchford, Temagami, Liskeard, and so on and so forth, Timiskaming Shores, to pay hundreds of dollars more for a monthly service that should be much more cost efficient for what we're saying is an essential service. And the comment with regards to utilities, we're at a point where the digital highway should be considered a utility. And how are we going to reconcile that with the bills that we know are going to happen to make us reach those CRTC goals? So thank you all. I appreciate your time and patience as we ran a few minutes longer. And this is not the end of the conversation. NEOnet will make a role to reach out to all of you with this slide deck. And if both Dan and Amadeo are willing, we'll include those in there as well. And this way you'll have contacts through NEOnet. And I think there's an opportunity where we can maybe do a regular communication going out, as we do for our traditional stakeholders on a monthly basis, to say, here's what we got. Here's something you may or may not know of. Here's a new funding opportunity. Did you know that Temagami and the Temagami First Nation have just now reached this opportunity with this other community? It's to make sure that that dialogue continues. Not a one-way, but definitely a multi-way. So thank you all. I appreciate your time.